So it's 9:15 Eastern Time, so we are just going to be live soon. Jojolapa, Namaskar, good evening, and good morning. The audience is from the Nepal. It's my pleasure and it's my honor to be back on the eDaboo. Actually, the month of January is special for eDaboo. Special in the sense that on 2017 January, from that time that we have started doing the Facebook Live. So in that sense that we are pretty young and we are on the fourth, we have just concluded our fourth year. And in this time that I'm really humbled that all the audiences, well-wishers, they have been encouraging me and our team to go ahead. And initially when we started, we just thought that possibly we may be as going up to the episode number 50. By then we assumed that a lot of other medias, other platforms will be there. And at that time, it may not be as our significance, but because of your love, because of your well-wishing, and because of your all ideas that you have been implementing to us. So today we are in the 61st episode. And today you know that we have a great scholar, Jessica Vantine Birkenholtz, and who will be giving her presentation in Swasthani. And you know today's topic for discussions. So I would like to welcome Jessica with us. Hi, Jessica. Welcome to the eDaboo.
Namaskar.
Yeah, before she starts her presentation, let me just give you her short bio. Definitely you can get, we can talk about her work for long, but I will just start the short bio. So Jessica Vantine Birkenholtz, she is Associate Professor of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies and Asian Studies. She specializes in women, gender, and religion in South Asia, particularly in Hindu societies and cultures. She has been doing research in Nepal since the early 2000s, where her work centers primarily on the construction and intersections of Hindu religious and gender ideologies, identity, and practice in and around the Kathmandu Valley. She is interested in the processes through which ancient and medieval texts, practices, and ideology, especially gender ideology, continue to manifest and are challenged in the modern, secularizing Hindu world. Her book, Reciting the Goddess, Narratives of Place and the Masking of Hinduism in Nepal, which was published by Oxford University Press on 2018, which earned the 2019 American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion in the Textual Studies category, presents an archival and ethnographic study of Nepal's local goddess Swasthani, the widely read Swasthani Vratakatha, and the role both goddess and text have played in the construction of Nepali Hindu identity and practice. Following the interest generated by reciting the goddess, she is working on the Secret Vow of the Goddess, an English translation of the Swasthani Vratakatha, a project supported by an NES Scholarly Editions and Translations grant and under contract with Oxford University Press. So once again, I welcome you, Jessica, and floor is yours.
नमस्कार मलाई यस कार्यक्रममा निमन्त गर्नुभएकोमा हार्दिक धन्यवाद भन्न चाहन्छु। यहाँ तपाईहरुसँग मैले गरेको स्वस्तानीको अध्ययनका केही कुराहरु सञ्च गर्न पाउँदा मलाई धेरै खुसी लागेको छ। सबभन्दा पहिले म तपाईहरुलाई मेरो आफ्नै कुरा बताउँछु। मैले कसरी स्वस्तानी बारेको अध्ययन सुरु गरेँ र कसरी अगाडि बढे त्यसपछि म स्वस्थानीको कसरी एउटा समृद्ध संस्कृतिका रूपमा विकास भयो भने कुरा देखाउन इतिहासबाट केही उदाहरणहरू दिनेछु र अन्तमा म अहिले हामीले मनाइरहेको स्वस्थानी व्रत परम्परा यसको महत्त्व यसको विकास र यसमा आएको नयाँ परिवर्तनहरूको बारेमा आफ्नो केही कुरा राख्नेछु मलाई आजभन्दा 25 वर्ष पहिले सन् 1996 इसी सम्बत BA को विद्यार्थीका रूपमा पहिले पटक नेपालमा आउँदा स्वस्थानीको बारेमा सुनेकी हुँ त्यो माफ गर्नुहोस् I should start sharing my screen. ल त्यो बेला स्वस्थानीको बारेमा केही थाहा नभएको मेरो मनमा पहिलो पटक यसबारे जाने रुचि पैदा भयो र जसरी 20 वर्ष पहिले रोपिएको त्यो विन्यासको बिउ Oxford University Pressबाट 2018 मा Reciting the Goddess Narratives of Place and the Making of Nepal किताबको रूपमा हुर्किएर बढेर अनि छापिएको बाहिर आएको छ यसै बीचमा युनिभर्सिटी अफ शिकागोमा धर्म हिन्दू धर्म र खास गरी दक्षिण एसियामा हिन्दू धर्मको बारेमा अध्ययन गर्न गए त्यसपछि मेरो PhD को विषय नै स्वस्थानी देवी र स्वस्थानी व्रतकथा हुन पुग्यो मैले थाहा पाउँदा स्वस्थानी यस्ती देवी थिइन् यसको बारेमा नेपाल बाहिरका मान्छेहरूलाई थाहा थिएन यो महिलाहरूको व्रत परम्परा थियो हुन त समय बित्दै जाँदा यसमा केही परिवर्तनहरू पनि भइरहेका छन् यी कुराले मलाई सुरुमा स्वस्थानीको रिसर्चतिर आकर्षित गरे र यसको कथा पनि मेरो लागि अर्को रमाइलो कुरा थियो यसले मलाई मेरो संस्कृत र नेपाली भाषा भएको रुचिले गर्दा आकर्षित गर्यो र मलाई नयाँ भाषा नेपाल भाषा सिक्ने मौका पनि दियो साथै यो व्रत परम्परा पक्का र अरू भन्दा नितान्त फरक नेपाली परम्परा थियो अर्को कुरा के हो के भने दक्षिण एसियनको हिन्दू धर्मबाट को छलफलमा एकाडेमिक छलफलमा म भारत र हिन्दू धर्मको भारतीय परम्परा र फरकहरूको बारेमा मात्र कुरा गरिने हुनाले म नेपाललाई पनि त्यहाँ ल्याउन चाहन्थे अब म अंग्रेजीमा बोल्छु My project began as a straightforward project to uncover how, when, and why the Swasthani Vratakatha transformed from an 8-folio legend about a local goddess to a several hundred printed page Purana text that has long been the primary source for Hindu mythology and ideology in Nepal. It was like a big puzzle to me, searching through hundreds of manuscripts in the archives, hunting for moments of expansion and change and other illuminating details, especially unexpected ones. However, as the picture became clearer about the Swasthani Katha's remarkable transformation and resilience from the late 16th century to the present day, another picture emerged as well, several, in fact. I was able to read through the lines in between manuscripts to discover multiple histories in the folios of the Swasthani Katha. Swasthani manuscripts, which have an unbroken line of transmission from 1573 Isi Sambat, which is 693 Nepal Sambat, to the present day, recorded much more than the history of this particular Devi and her Vrat Katha. Yes, these texts tell the history of a local Devi, but the history of the Swasthani Katha also tells a history of Nepal, a history of Hinduism in Nepal, and therefore also a history of the Newars in Nepal. It tells the intertwined dynamic linguistic and literary histories of Nepal Bhasa, Khas Bhasa, and Sanskrit in Nepal, and the origin of Nepali print culture. It tells us about Nepal's engagement with and reaction to India and the British. So while my book contains lots of facts and dates about when this or that happened to the Swasthani Vrata Katha, and I'm going to share many of those details with you today and happy to answer whatever questions you might have, the bigger aim of my work has been to use the Swasthani Vrata Katha as a lens through which we can see and understand the forces, influences, and mechanisms through which Nepali Hinduism and Hindu identity was forged, especially vis-a-vis Indian forms of Hinduism and Hindu identity. The Swasthani Katha, through its devotees, scribes, patrons, and other persons, has recorded and was used as a tool for propagating local responses to major upheavals and paradigmatic shifts in Nepal's political, social, and religious landscapes since the 16th century. Religion helps individuals and communities make sense of their place in the world. Mythology and other religious narratives create a shared vocabulary and experience through which stories that are current in a society or culture and provide a foundation for that society or culture. I'd like to suggest that the Swasthani Vrata Katha evolved precisely in order to do that, to help Newars and later Parvatiya Hindus to make sense of their place in Nepal Mandala and Nepal more broadly, especially as the meaning and borders of Nepal expanded, literally and symbolically, and as Nepal Mandala diversified to include more and more non-Newars who brought with them new ideas, worldviews, and ways of being Hindu, and as more and more Newars traveled and settled outside of the Kathmandu Valley. The transformations the Swasthani Katha has undergone mark transitional periods where the local community grappled with an influx of people, ideas, and ways of being Hindu, being Newar, and being Nepali. In what follows, I draw on my 20 years of researching the Swasthani Katha Parampara. This has included extensive archival research at the Rastriya Abhilakhalaya, Asa Safakurti, Kaiser Library, Maran Puraska Pustakalaya, and private collections, as well as many months of living in Sankhu, where I observed the month-long Swasthani Madhav Narayan Vrata, interviewed Vratalu and local residents, and photographed a dozen or so private copies of the Swasthani Katha. It's interesting to note that all that we know about the Swasthani Vrata Katha Parampara comes from Swasthani Katha Granth. Despite the text's popularity, there is virtually no other historical documentation of Swasthani Devi, her Katha, or the Vrat outside of these Swasthani Katha manuscripts and living memories. Let me briefly acknowledge the many people who have helped me with my work over the years in various ways, although I certainly cannot name everyone. In Kathmandu, Kashinath Tamot, Jwala Stapit, Aishwarya Sharma, Gita Manandar, and in Sankhu, Prakashman Srestha, Prakashman Srestha, Pravin Raj Srestha, and their families, and the many families who welcomed me into their homes and provided me access to their Swasthani texts, as well as the many chairmen and committee members of the Salinari Madhav Narayan Swasthani Vrata Mila Samiti, who facilitated my access to the Vrata over the years. And also to Susan Shrestha and others with the Newar Organization of America and the World Newar Organization who have invited me to share my work in previous years, and Pramesh Sharma here today. Aru bhane dheri jana hunhunsa, sabai jana lai dheri dhanyabad, dheri dhanyabad. Tapai harule naigas project lay safal ra mahatwapurna banauna maha yog ganabhayo. La. The Swasthani Vrata Katha originated in the Kathmandu Valley in the late 16th century. In only 8 folios or pages, It told the story of Swasthani's benevolence and wrath as garnered by the devoted Ama Gomadzu, her dharmic Chora Nagaraj, and her adharmic Buhari Chandravati. The story was transmitted almost exclusively in Nepal Bhasa, and as far as can be discerned, remained local to the Kathmandu Valley. Three defining features characterize these early Swasthani Katha: their structure and function as a Vrat Katha, their local origin and circulation among the Newars, and their Shakta orientation as a folk goddess tradition. Its subsequent changes to the text with respect to these three key aspects, its genre, language, and religious focus, that both highlight the text's inclusive, heterogeneous, and fluid nature, but also ultimately mark its shift to a canonized, homogeneous, Brahmanical text over time. But for the first 200 years, from the 16th to 18th century Isi Sambat, the Swasthani Katha grew in popularity, though little else changed about this local tale of a local Devi. After over 2 centuries as a local Newar tantric influenced Shakta tradition, the Swasthani Katha underwent a series of transformations between the 18th and early 20th century in 4 phases. The first phase of narrative expansion began in the mid-18th century and added to the original Swasthani folk narrative the well-known Shaiva Purana narrative cycle that features Shiva, Sati Devi's father, Daksha Prajapati, as well as Shiva's subsequent marriage to Parvati, the births of their children, Ganesh and Kumar, and the battle with the demons or Tripur. The addition of these stories drastically increased Shiva's role in the narrative and imbued the text with a distinctly Shaiva flavor. Shiva was not new to the Swasthani Katha, of course. He historically played a small but critical role as both the narrator of the Katha and as an actor in the narrative as well. However, with these Puranic additions, Shiva was forefronted in the newly expanded Swasthani Katha. Quite literally, these Shaiva stories were put at the beginning of the text and so preceded the original local legend. They positioned Shiva as a much more visible presence in the text than Swasthani Devi, who, depending on the text, physically appears only once, maybe twice, or most commonly, not at all. Of further significance in these Shaiva narratives is that they shifted the focus and domain of action from the human local realm, Martya Lok, depicted in the original Gomaju Navaraj Chandravati story, to the cosmic divine realm, Devalok, that is shared among and unites much of the Hindu world. In doing so, these Purana stories introduce into the Swasthani Katha a vocabulary and worldview near universally understood among Hindus in Nepal, India, and elsewhere in the world. Conversely, this brought the Swasthani Katha into that broader Hindu world, unconfined by cultural and political boundaries. But this was a marked departure from the foundational Gomaju Navaraj Chandravati story that focuses on everyday concerns, especially those with which women in particular must contend, such as child marriage, the move from a woman's maiti to her husband's gar, motherhood, and widowhood. So the local Shakta Swasthani Katha of the 16th century and the 18th century is repositioned as a more translocal Shaiva text, or at least a Shaiva Shakta text. A second phase of narrative integration began in the late 18th century. It introduced a creation narrative according to which the demon duo Madhu and Kaitaba encounter Brahma, Vishnu, and Devi and give rise to the universe and its divine and human populations. An account of Puranic geography follows this popular creation story. These developments collectively serve to expand the temporal, geographic, and ideological scope of the text by focusing the action again in Devalok. Further, these Puranic stories take the audience out of the generic present of the local tale and back to the mythic past that begins with the very beginning of time. In doing so, the Swasthani Katha moves beyond the singular local focus on Swasthani Devi to not merely embrace but privilege pan-Indic male Dyota, most notably Shiva, but also Vishnu. At the same time, I would note the story's Shakta orientation. This myth originated actually as a Vaishnava story in the Mahabharata, in which Vishnu is the main actor and object of devotion. The Swasthani Katha, however, follows the details of the 6th century telling found in the Devi Mahatmya, the Haja Atma of all Shakta texts, and so downplays Vishnu's role and links Swasthani with Mahamaya. I read this as a reaction against the first phase of narrative expansion that infused an initially local Shakta tale with a heavy dose of Sanskritic Shaivism. These sectarian shifts and expansion of the as yet still Newari traditions ideological framework speak to the diversification of Hindu practice and identity with the influx of Parvatiya bound Kshatriya Hindus into the Kathmandu Valley in the 18th century, after, of course, the conquest of the Kathmandu Valley's 3 Newar kingdoms in 1768 and 69, and the ensuing establishment of the Shah ruling regime. The Swasthani Katha became an important but a subtle, innocuous outlet for the lay public to variously process, articulate, promulgate, and otherwise navigate this dramatic shift in the religious, social, and political landscape of late medieval and early modern Nepal. These changing dynamics were readily apparent in the third phase of narrative expansion that occurred in the 19th century. The new Shaha rulers saw Nepal Bhasa and Newar literature as an obstacle and even threat to their rule and quickly banned it. Extant Newar Swasthani Katha manuscripts from this period confirmed, however, that Newars nevertheless continued to produce and recite the Swasthani Katha in Nepal Bhasa. Further, there was a renewed focus on the Newar elements of the text, namely the Gomaju, Navaraj, and Chandravati core folk narrative. This foundational Newar layer of the text, however, became the site upon which the influence of Brahmanical Parvatiya ideology can most readily be seen. It was into the folios of Gomaju's and Chandravati's story that scribes injected a series of didactic sub-narratives, teaching stories focused on Stri Dharma, or women's socio-religious duty. These sub-narratives include the following: Dharma Lakshmi Samvada, Dharamuketa Raja, Pativrata Dharma, Shivaratri Katha, Nala Damayanti, portions of the Markandeya Purana that deal with women's dharma and position in society, and in at least a couple of manuscripts, significant portions of the Ramayana. These didactic sub-narratives of the third phase, individually and collectively, differed from the aforementioned Shaiva Purana stories in important ways. Most notably, they are set in Martyalok, in contrast to the Devalok focus of the Purana narratives. Moreover, they were incorporated into the folk narrative by inserting them into the words Gomaju utters as a child bride to console her parents, or they her, by reciting tropes on the duties of the devout Hindu wife. In my book, I demonstrate at greater length that these conservative Pativrata-focused stories were a response to debates about the idea and role of the Hindu woman in neighboring British India at the time that ultimately encouraged Hindu women's education in India, a shift rejected by Nepal's ruling elite, who promoted instead the orthodox idea of the dutiful and subservient Pativrata. Another distinctive element in the third phase was its uneven appearance in Swasthani Vrata Katha Granth. Not all Newar Swasthani Katha texts incorporated the didactic sub-narratives, and when they did not necessarily incorporate all of them, as you can see from this sampling of manuscripts that are preserved at the Rastra Abhilakalaya. That's the first few of these on this table. Their inclusion or absence seems to reflect personal preference on the part of the scribe or commissioner of the text. Yet it also seems that certain sub-narratives were popular at certain times or among texts composed in the same village or region. Several Swasthani Katha texts belonging to families in Sankhu, for instance, contain nearly identical selections of the same 4 or 5 sub-narratives, as you can see on the bottom half of this table. This phase underscores the stable core shared among Newari Swasthani manuscripts, but also these Newari texts' inherent flexibility and adaptability, which highlights a central source of their heterogeneity. With the inclusion of these didactic narratives, each of the 3 main Hindu sectarian traditions, Shaktism, Shaivism, and Vaishnavism, are present, if not equally accounted for, in the Swasthani Katha. Now, in the early 19th century, the Swasthani Katha experienced another significant development. It was translated into the Nepali language, into Khas Kora. Up to this time, the Swasthani Katha had been almost exclusively transmitted in Nepal Bhasa, and so circulated only among Newars. The third phase of development differentially transformed these Nepali language Swasthani texts. Specifically, while their Newar cousin brothers variously incorporated one or more of the didactic sub-narratives, the new Nepali language Swasthani Katha text introduced a final series of Shaiva narratives. These include Shiva in the pine forest, with the rishis and their wives, the burning of Kamadeva, and the battle with the demon Jalandhar and his wife Vrinda. Like the Puranic tales of the first and second phases, and in contrast to the didactic sub-narratives of the third phase for Newar texts, these stories are again set in Devalok and precede the local Swasthani legend. As with the earlier Shaiva narratives, none of these stories invoke Swasthani explicitly, or in this case, even implicitly. Furthermore, with this last set of Purana tales, Swasthani Devi was forever relegated to the last third of her own text. Another interesting aspect of these quote-unquote new Nepali Swasthani Katha texts was the uniformity they exhibited from the get-go that was previously unseen in Newar Swasthani texts. Newar Swasthani texts varied widely in terms of length and any organizing structure, such as chapters. You can see in these different images of manuscripts, their size varies quite considerably. 65 on the small end to 457 on the larger end. In contrast, the earliest Nepali language Swasthani Katha texts adopted a consistent 22 chapter format across the board. So Nepali Swasthani texts were simultaneously innovating with new Shaiva stories and also standardizing themselves. Now, the translation of the Swasthani Katha into Nepali represented a culminating articulation of an ongoing broadening of conceptions of tradition, locality, and identity. This had, in fact, begun much earlier, as evidenced by the literary and ideological trajectories of Nepal's other local Purana literature. The increased awareness of Nepal as a sacred place and as part of a larger social and political world on the Indian subcontinent was seen in the earlier development of Nepal's Pashupati Purana, Nepala Mahatmya, and Hemavat Khanda. Namely, the 14th century Pashupati Purana's very specific local focus on the sacred Pashupatinath Mandir in Kathmandu gave way to in the 17th century to the Nepala Mahatmya, which glorified the larger Nepal Mandala region that was synonymous with the Kathmandu Valley in that period. The later Hemavat Khanda then built upon the Nepala Mahatmya to position and glorify Nepal as part of an even larger sacred region. This reflected at both the local and regional level, shifting perceptions and experiences of key concepts of locality, most notably of Pashupatinath as a holy site, and later of Nepal as a sacred region. These expanded to accommodate the changing realities of these geographic and cultural associations and identities as the increasing political, economic, and cultural interaction between the indigenous Newar population of the valley and high caste Parvatiya Hindus and Indian Hindus altered the frame of reference for religious and geocultural identification. Similarly, what was once a short Newar legend about the local Swasthani Devi thus became an expansive Purana text that serves as a primary source for all Nepali Hindu religious, social, and cultural belief and practice. That is, it today serves as a Nepalese Hindu tradition rather than just a Newar or Parvatiya one. As such, the Swasthani Katha looks outward as much as it looks inward locally in its articulation of place, meaning, and identity. Simultaneously, the development of the Swasthani Katha reveals an active dialogue between Shaivas, Vaishnavas, and Shaktas, as well as Newar, Parvatiya, and Indian Hindus at the local and regional, lay, and elite levels in pre-modern and early modern Nepal. It's not uncommon in Hindu South Asia for devotional traditions to intersect and be mapped onto one another. in the context of Nepal's social and political history, and as evidence in the textual and narrative development of the Swasthani Katha in particular, these intersections reflect more than just a simple nod into the diversity of Hindu beliefs and practices in Nepal, which historically were, of course, not labeled specifically as Hindu, right? That terminology comes much later. I would suggest that the seamless inclusion of Shaiva and Vaishnava Purana narratives in the folk Shakta Swasthani Katha does, however, reflect the emergence of a hegemonic Hindu identity that did take on greater social and political meaning in the 19th and early 20th century. It was during this period that Nepal's ruling elite, starting with Prithvi Narayan Shah much earlier, projected Nepal as the Asal Hindustan, and later as the world's only Hindu kingdom. These were powerful religious statements and political moves in response to twice colonized and therefore, in their eyes, twice defiled Hindu India. Now, to return to the fourth phase of expansion, which occurred in the early 20th century. This marked the last major moment of transformation of the Swasthani Katha. Newar and Nepali Swasthanis continued on very different trajectories. Newar Swasthani Katha manuscripts wove into their folios the final set of Shaiva narratives that had been incorporated into Nepali Swasthani Kathas a century earlier. Nepali Swasthanis, on the other hand, were taken to the printing presses in Benares, the site of early Nepali publishing. Reproduction of the Swasthani Katha in print effectively crystallized the narrative, though it was in print that the 22 chapter model expanded to the 31 chapter model, which of course conveniently corresponds to the 31 days of Magh Mahina and characterizes all modern printed Nepali Swasthani Katha kitab. As for Newar Swasthanis, they were never mass produced in print because of the ban on Nepal Bhasa and Newar literature. Neither Nepali nor Newar Swasthani, neither Nepali nor Newar Swasthani Vratakatha kitab or Granth, whether handwritten or in print, have changed much, if at all, since this period. Print technology, however, enabled the inclusion of an unprecedented number of images and illustrations, which distinguishes printed Swasthani Katha kitab from most of their manuscript predecessors and was an important innovation. This is a sample of the most common illustrations found in these early 20th century printed Swasthani Vratakatha kitab. Some of these images may be familiar to you. I've got several slides, depending on what the copy of the Swasthani Vratakatha your family has, while others only exist in these early print editions of the Swasthani Katha. There are more images than I have time to show here, so I've only included a few. So here we have Swasthani with the Asamatrika on the lotus flower. This is Puranic Bhughol geography with Sumeru in the middle. Ganesh, Saraswati, Kumar, and Agastya. And here at the bottom, I would note, and I'll come back to this, a Swasthani yantra in this image. 2 more pages. There's probably at least 2 to 4 more pages of images like this in most of these early 20th century printed Swasthani books. The images of Swasthani Devi in particular, in fact, reflect a major evolution of the goddess's iconography, about which I'd like to say something briefly. Swasthani Devi was historically described in rich detail in the Swasthani Katha. Yet there were no images, no carvings, murti, or other depictions of her. This is striking given the way that deities populate and ornament every nook and cranny of the Kathmandu Valley. Remarkably, the oldest image that we have of Swasthani dates to 1674. It's a murti consecrated by Pratap Malla and now sits in Makantol near the Talaju temple. You can see that she sits here with Shiva in consort-like fashion. Without looking closely or reading the inscription, it would be very easy to assume that this is Shiva and Parvati. We don't have any other images. So this is 1674. We don't have any other images of Swasthani until the early 1800s. And you can see here in this 1808 Isi Sambat Swasthani Pratakatha, the next image that I've been able to find, which is in a much more recent Granth in 1945, depicts essentially the same picture in much finer detail. But we can see here that in the early 1800s, she was still very much associated with Shiva as his consort. But in the late 19th century, Swasthani suddenly divorces Shiva and takes up an association with the Asamatrika, initially as a yantra, and later in anthropomorphic form. So here we have her in this yantra with Asamatrika, and later in this 1915 text, the Asamatrika she's sitting above them. Only very rarely is Swasthani depicted sitting on her own, without either Shiva or the Asamatrika. And here are two images from early 20th century Swasthani Kitab. So as many of you are likely aware, it is with the Asamatrika that the Swasthani is today most commonly represented, right? These are very familiar images. And if you go to Sankhu, you can even buy a copy of Bhupendraman Shrestha's interpretation of this image that he painted himself. And it is upon his drawing, this drawing that you're looking at right now, that the most recent image of Swasthani is based. The Swasthani Devi Murti in Sankhu's new Swasthani Mandir, which I will turn to again shortly. For those of you familiar with the most contemporary editions of the Swasthani Pratakatha sold in Bhatayati and Kathmandu's other bazaars, you know that today's popular editions boast an image of Shiva alone, or Shiva and Parvati, or Shiva, Parvati, and Ganesh with or without Kumar on the cover or title page, only later followed by the image of Swasthani with Asamatrika and the image of the Puranic geography, and then smaller images at the start of each chapter. So this all brings me to my final points. While these pictorial aspects of the Swasthani Pratakatha have continued to change, little, if anything, in the narrative, in the story, has changed since the early 20th century. This is remarkable, given the incredible transformations the Swasthani Katha narrative underwent between the 18th and early 20th century during periods of significant political and social transformation. It's also remarkable, given that Nepal has continued to experience major social and political upheaval over the course of the last century. The return of King Tribhuvan in 1951, the Jana Andolan movements of the 1990s, the Maoist war and its aftermath, which led to a surge in identity politics among Nepal's many ethnic groups, and ultimately to the dissolution of the Hindu monarchy and establishment of Nepal as a democratic republic. In light of these histories of both the text and of the country, why has the Swasthani Katha not responded? Why have devotees and scribes not turned to the Swasthani as they have in the past to react to digest, to respond to these developments? I don't have an answer to these questions, but pose it to you all for your consideration. The question seems particularly important today in the 21st century, in light of increased awareness and discussion of women's roles and rights, feminist activism, and critiques of the Swasthani tradition, which have become increasingly vocal over the last decade. I think often about the Ramayana, which shares much in common with the Swasthani Katha. It's widely known throughout South Asia, much like the Swasthani is widely known throughout Hindu Nepal. Both constitute an important shared vocabulary for their audiences that help articulate the world and how to best move through it. Both were written long ago by men and privileged men, and the examples provided by male characters, at whose hands women suffer greatly and without much, if any, consideration. This inequity in the Ramayana, particularly the injustices that Sita faced, have been taken up through a rewriting of the Ramayana from Sita's perspective. in Sita yanas. This was in fact first done in the 16th century, quite some time ago, by a female Bengali poet named Chandravati. And her name is here very coincidental. Unsurprisingly, Chandravati's Ramayana never received the amount of attention that so many other famous versions of the Ramayana did. She was a woman, after all, and her Ramayana presented a counter-narrative to the dominant ones, to Valmiki's, to Kanban's, to Tulsidas's. Her early efforts were taken up more recently by others who have re-envisioned the Ramayana epic from Sita's perspective. Samhita Armi's and Moyen's Chitrakar's Sita's Ramayana was in fact on the New York Times bestseller list. So what might the Swasthani Katha read like if it were written by a woman today? If it were written from Gomaju's perspective or Chandravati's perspective? What if it were written from Swasthani's perspective? Most Swasthanis today are at least 2/3 stories of Shiva and other deities from the Mahapuranas. Swasthani, Gomaju, Nagaraj, and Chandravati are sequestered to the last section of the text. If she were here to tell her own story, would it look the same? What would she have to say about one's own place, her place, your place, Nepal's place? Would she empower women? And if so, what would that look like? Or what might it look like if the text were written, reimagined by a Newar, male, female, transgender, today? Would it look the same if it were written by a Newar from Sankhu, a Newar from Darjeeling, or a Newar living abroad? Let me offer 2 examples of how devotees, patrons, visitors, and even business people are engaging the Swasthani Katha in new ways. First, you may be aware that residents of Sankhu, who might be listening here with us today, have been inscribing the Swasthani narrative on the sacred landscape surrounding the Salinadi over the last decade or so to bring the narrative alive and enable devotees to engage with the narrative in an experiential way, to not just observe the Bratalu with greater ease, but to themselves participate in the narrative by visiting Gomaju's hut and seeing the site of the Palanquin bearers, for example. The consecration of the Swasthani Murti and Mandir were significant innovations for a goddess who did not, as I just said, have many mandirs dedicated to her and only one other extant Murti. For the first time, Swasthani, the goddess of one's own place, has her own place. Remarkably, in fact, Swasthani now has not only one, but 2 places of her own, 2 mandir. My second example takes us out of Nepal to Himachal Pradesh, where almost contemporaneously with the consecration of Sankhu's Swasthani Mandir, an Indian devotee who had learned of Swasthani from a Newar classmate in law school in Delhi some years before, consecrated in 2013 a mandir to Swasthani Devi, which also houses a murti of the goddess. This marks the first instance of Swasthani and the Swasthani Brata Katha being worshipped and celebrated outside of Nepal and outside of a Nepali-speaking community specifically. You can see from these photos that there are significant differences in the style of the murti and mandir. Also, for this Indian community of devotees, reading the Swasthani Brata Katha is not limited to Magh Mahina, but is read year-round. These developments and differences are a good reminder of how relatively young the Swasthani Katha parampara is, and how great the potential for further transformation still is. I think again of the many Ramayanas that centuries after Valmiki spawned different regional favorites, including Banu Bhakta's Ramayana in Nepal. The Swasthani Katha parampara has been characterized by innovation and resilience throughout its history. As renowned scholar of Buddhism, Charles Hallisey argues, quote, if the survival of any particular text is not self-explanatory, but in fact is normally the case that texts fade in their significance as social change occurs, then we need to discover how these texts that do endure are maintained. The Swasthani Katha presents us with an opportunity to examine one such living tradition that has not merely survived, but thrived, even within a historically non-literate culture. As Chhatra Bahadur Kayastha reminds us, quote, in those days, even though not many people could read, they would get a copy of the Swasthani Katha written for them. During the month of Magh, those who could read would be called upon by families to recite the story for them, end quote. The Swasthani Katha is a living tradition that has belonged to the people, as opposed to just purohits or pundits or the royal court, and especially belonged to Newars, and historically has been a site of negotiation and articulation of Hindu identity and practice in Nepal. These are ongoing processes. Swasthani Devi and the Swasthani Vrata Katha are not static, but dynamic. I raise these questions as we enter into another Swasthani season to encourage dialogue and discussion about what Swasthani means in the 21st century. Questioning, rethinking, imagining alternate versions does not take away from the value of the Swasthani Katha as a cultural treasure that represents so many different aspects of Newar and more broadly Nepali history and identity. But we must remember that history is always in the making. I would suggest that the Swasthani Katha's ability to evolve, and thus the ability and the need of the tradition's devotees and audience to evolve, has played a key role in its survival and continued relevance for many still today. This last century has arguably been the longest period the text has not changed since its earliest years. As an accidental but very dedicated devotee of Swasthani Devi through my 20 or 25 years of studying her, this leaves me eager with anticipation to see what changes lie ahead for the Swasthani Katha Parampara. Its future will be determined in the present. Shubhe. Sunu Sagdena. Pramesh.
Hey, thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much. That is really, thought-provoking, especially as in your later part, right? The way that you have given your presentation is really awesome. So would you like to start the sharing at this point so that I have a couple of questions? Actually, I have so many questions, but I just try to, summarize, and I will be having with you QA session, maybe the 3 or 4 questions. So at this point, would you like to stop this one?
Should you like me to stop sharing?
Yes, please.
What's up?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So eDaboo at this moment, right, is, very pleased with the presentation that you have done, and especially in the later part that you have just given the thought-provoking presentation. And so by then, there are so many questions that it came in, but I'm just taking the related questions to your presentations. But rather than the presentation that you have, some of the questions that is regarding the Swasthani Vrata Katha itself. So the first one that it came, that it says, it's asking that, is Lavanya Des in Vrata Katha is present Sankhu? So do you have any answer for this, Jessica?
That's an interesting question. So historically, in Puranas Swasthani Vrata Katha Granth, there are no specific place names. Sali Nadi Konam Tina, Nadi Matare Bantyo, Ganga Konam Matare Ayo. So it only mentions the Ganga, but of course Ganga could mean the Ganga, but it could also just mean a river. So it's not until, I think, the 19th or 20th century that the nadi becomes the Sali nadi. And why it becomes the Sali nadi? It could be really for any number of reasons, right? And so even though the old texts do mention Lavanya Desh, there's nothing that tells us specifically that it's Sankhu. And so I've never been able to find any more concrete information. Again, we don't have any documentation about the tradition, about the Vrat or the Vrat Katha or Swasthani Devi outside of these manuscripts. So all I can say for fact is that everything was very generic for many, many hundreds of years. And then suddenly the nadi that Chandravati and the porters fall into becomes the Sali nadi. And so I suspect that a devotee decided to give it that name. That would be one way of explaining that. And then Sankhu becomes more involved. That being said, Prakash Mansrasa could probably give, who is a resident and local historian in Sankhu, could probably give a different explanation that explains the history of Sankhu being named Lavanya Desh. And it has had that name for a while, but quite honestly, I'm not sure if it had that name before it was connected via the Sali nadi to the Katha, or if that connection as Lavanya Desh came through the Swasthani Katha or not. There's also one, to be honest, I don't remember which one, but I remember reading a Swasthani Vrata Katha kitab, so it was more contemporary. In the introduction, the writer had explained the kind of the local geography of Sankhu, and that Chandravati's mighty was maybe Nepa, and so had kind of mapped out the whole geography within the Kathmandu Valley. But a lot of that, in terms of textual evidence, is very minimal and hard to actually pinpoint.
Thank you, Jessica. So let's go to the next question. So next question is very interesting. Actually, this question is also mine also. So in Swasthani Brata, right, in Sankhu, even though it says the Swasthani Brata, but we have been seeing that it's somehow, or is it related to Madhav Narayan? If yes, how it is related to Madhav Narayan?
These are very good questions that are not very easy to answer. So this is a question that has long perplexed me. And I remember when the very first time that I saw the Swasthani Brata in Sankhu was in 1999. And I was in between my undergrad, my BA studies and my PhD studies. And I spent a year in Nepal studying women's traditions, and the Swasthani was one of them. And so my first month in Sankhu, I remember listening to Madhav Narayan, the chant, Madhav Narayan, Madhav Narayan, Madhav Narayan. But at the time, all I really knew was the Katha, which is so full of Shiva stories, Mahadev. So that entire month, I assumed, and I heard them saying Mahadev, Mahadev, instead of Madhav Narayan, Madhav Narayan. And I've met many Nepalis who tell me that they thought the same thing as well. And so this is a really common confusion about what the relationship is between Madhav Narayan and Swasthani. And in my experience, it depends on who you ask. For a long time in Sankhu, when I would ask local residents, they would say, this is the Madhav Narayan Brat, and others would say, this is the Swasthani Brat. And it kind of depended on where your devotional, you know, who you were more devoted to in a way. Over the years, what's become clearer, there's been a clearer explanation that I've heard from Prakash Mantresa and others, and hopefully I can do this justice to what he would say, which is that Madhav Narayan is the name of Vishnu during the month of Magh. And that is actually a known fact. We can find that in different Sanskritic sources. They also say that Swasthani is Bhadragini's name during the month of Magh. I've not been able to find any other historical Sanskrit sources that explain that. But the idea is that when in the story, Parvati comes to Vishnu, and he's the one who instructs her to perform the vrat. And he ends up kind of getting permission from Vajrayogini in order to do this. And so what's happening in the vrat is that the women are performing the vrat and they're thanking Vishnu, who in the month of Magh is Madhav Narayan. They're thanking him for, the Vratalu are thanking him. They're all kind of embodying Parvati, thanking him for instructing them in the Swasthani Varta. So that's kind of the local interpretation or explanation. But it's also very, there's still a lot of kind of things that are still not even clear to me. And I've been asking these questions for a very, very long time. So in the Swasthani, there's nowhere that says there's the worship of Vishnu in the way that Madhav Narayan is worshipped. And there's no pilgrimage in the way that for the Madhav Narayan Brat, they travel to Parping, to Panoti, to Pashupati, right, to Changunarayan, to meet the three other Narayans. And so that's clearly part of the Madhav Narayan Bharta. So there are definitely aspects that belong to each separate Bharta. And historically, there's only one kind of piece of information, and that comes, I believe it was in the 17th century, that there's, I don't have the reference right at the top of my head, but that suggests that there was a merger between the Madhav Narayan and Swasthani Bharta. And that had a lot to do with the fact that initially the Swasthani Bharta in the Purana Prachim Swasthani Grantha, the Bharta lasts only 2 days and 2 nights. But now, of course, it lasts a full month. And the Madhav Narayan Bharta has always, as far as we know, and there's also very little documentation about the Madhav Narayan Bharta, has always been a month in duration. And so my theory is that that these two kind of combined at one point, and that expanded the Swasthani Bharta into a month. And you know, these were two things that were happening at roughly the same time, and that they were ultimately combined. And Balgopal Shrestha writes a little bit about this in his book on Sankhu.
Thank you. It's very interesting. So normally,
well,
yes, please go ahead.
It makes me think also of, I've had many experiences during the Swasthani Mela, where of course now there is the Swasthani Mandir that if you've been to Sankhu, it sits on top of the hill before you go down the stairs to the Nadi, to the Sali Nadi, and to where Madhav Narayan is worshipped during the daily puja. And of course, after the daily puja, when they open up the gates after the Bratalu and the participants have performed their puja, and devotees are allowed to come in and do their own puja to Madhav Narayan. And I've had so many experiences of conversations with visitors to Sankhu who are in line or who have just come from doing their worship of Madhav Narayan, but who assumed that it was Swasthani, and who didn't know until they happened to have a conversation with me and maybe others, that in fact, that's Madhav Narayan down by the river. And so it's always been interesting to me, and just an aspect of Hinduism that is really lovely, of all the different dyota have their own identities, but of course they're also one and the same, and it's meaningful to be able to do puja to any deity and to show that devotion, even if it might not be the deity that you thought that it was to begin with.
Excellent. So what I think is that this Newar culture itself is the art of complexity. So studying, yes, all this, it seems that you are unfolding this art of complexity. So thank you so much for doing that. But before I let you go, I have two more questions actually. The one question that just came in is asking that, did you find any changes when the Swasthani Vrat Katha was translated from Nepal Bhasa to Khas Bhasa? Would you like to take this question?
Sure. So in short, there were very few changes. The very oldest Kaskura Swasthani Vratakata Granth that we have was only the Swarga section, the Devalok section. And so it actually didn't even include the Chandravati Gomaju Navaraj story. But the next, and that was in 1810, Isi Sambat. In 1822 is the next oldest Kaskura Swasthani Granth that we have, and that did have the full story. But interestingly, there hasn't been, the narrative has been very consistent throughout. So we don't see any major deviations or major differences in the way the story is told. Certainly different phrases or different descriptions, small differences like that, but nothing very substantive other than the Nepali Swasthani Granth never introduced the didactic sub-narratives. So the Nepal Bhasa Swasthani Grantharu all have much more variation in them. In size, they're bigger, they're smaller. They may have these additional stories, they may not have them. Whereas the Nepali ones are kind of have those, the first two parts of, well, they ultimately have all three parts that the Newar ones have, but they lack this other kind of distinctive set of stories that Newar ones have. But in terms of the story itself, there's very little difference.
Thank you. So we have final questions. So one of the audience has asked how this Swasthani Vrat is relevant in today's life. So is it really relevant? What do you think? she's asking actually.
Well, I would actually say, what do you think? What does whoever asked that question think? And what do other Nepalis think? Because for me, you know, I'm not obviously not Nepali, I'm not Newar, and so I didn't grow up with this tradition. So I think the question, I think it really depends for each individual person and family what it means. It's a hard question to answer from my perspective, because I've seen and I've talked to so many Nepalis over the years, and I did a very focused kind of smaller research project a couple of years ago, asking this question of, particularly of women, what role does the Swasthani play in your lives today? But both women and men, I really got a mixed response. There were some women and men who are really devout and who really still find reciting the Swasthani meaningful, doing the vrat meaningful, and see its application in their daily lives, and look at Gomanju as a model for how to endure suffering, right? Or Chandravati, how to rethink one's devotion and actions, and how one can improve their situation. So there are definitely many Nepalis, from those that I've spoken with, who find a lot of strength from reading the Swasthani. But there are also a lot of Nepalis that I spoke with who don't find it to be very relevant today, who argue that it's outdated, and that it's reflecting a time and priorities that are different from what we have in contemporary Nepali culture, and who struggle with the way that women in particular, but also in relation to that, men are portrayed and treated in the text. So I think it really depends. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at, especially towards the end of my talk, is it's a really good question to ask. What is its relevance today? And how can we value the Swasthani for this great cultural legacy that it has, even if we're uncomfortable with what it's saying and with some of the messages that one might be able to take away from it. So, and again, as a living tradition, I think people's responses to it are going to change. Maybe from year to year, from generation to generation, but I really think that it's up to each family and each individual to decide, is it relevant? If it's relevant, why is it relevant? What about it is relevant? If it's not relevant, how can we make it relevant again? Should it be relevant again? What do we lose if we lose the Swasthani? I mean, one of the other kind of interesting things that I've observed over the years is that the Swasthani has been a way of teaching children to read. And, you know, by giving them the opportunity to do the nightly recitation, and familiarizing themselves, you know, with the language, with the script, with vocabulary, and with culture too, of course. And what is lost then right now if children don't have that opportunity? Of course, more children are going to school than maybe they were in the way past. But there is kind of a current, it's not a complete loss yet, but the Purana Nepal Bhasa Granth, many Newars cannot read it anymore. They don't know the old script. They don't know the old language, even if they speak modern Nepal Bhasa. And so what's going to happen to those texts, right? We can already kind of see a part of the tradition getting weak in a way. even though it remains very much alive and those families are now reading newer versions, often in Nepali, that I'm often told that if you grew up with a Nepal Bhasa, Swasthani Pratakatha, and you have to switch to a Nepali one, that it's not very satisfying, that the Nepal Bhasa ones are much richer and have a different feel to them than the Nepali ones, the Kaskota ones.
Thank you so much. So it seems that, what I learned today is that, right, you have you have challenged the Newar community actually. If we would like to, yes, keep our tradition alive, so we have to go back and we have to, no matter what or how we have to do that, this is our duty for Newar people's duty to, yes, to bring back those Newar scripted Swasthani Pratikatha. So this is what the take that I just felt today. So it's really thought-provoking that you have given the, yes, the ideas, how to, yes, how we can look at it, or how we can, how the different people have different perspective on this Pratikatha. You give the example of Ramayana, or even you say on perspective the Sita, what it would be. So similarly, so it seems that, but whatever, I mean, it's really, really thought-provoking. So thank you so much. So still we have a couple of other questions, but yeah, it's not that related to today's topic, so I'm not taking those questions. Okay. And yeah, we have, I mean, it's really, really interesting. So this within next 4 days in Nepal, actually it's in next 3 days, Swasthani Pratikatha or Swasthani Vrat is starting. So I guess that whoever the audience is, that whoever, yeah, they do their rituals, either the Vrat if they keep, or if they recite the Vrat Katha. So possibly, yes, with this your presentation, they have also some good reference or some good thought that, right, how do they perceive it? So once they start reciting this, possibly their perspective may have changed rather than merely just reciting those Vrat Katha. So this has been honor to eDaboo. Jessica, thank you so much. And we are trying to, yes, keep this tradition alive, to bring, yes, all those colors now, yeah, in the initial stage that we were just doing within the Newar people. So now we have started going to the Gair Newar, and we have been bringing all those colors that who can give us their perspective with their researches, and who can give us the presentation on our Newar culture and Newar civilization. So thank you so much for your time. And audiences, right, thank you so much. So as usual, please send us your questions, send us your feedback, and guide us. So all the programs is based on your guidance, questions, feedbacks. So we'll try to keep this tradition alive. And so I have to thank so many people. So before that, I think that Jessica wants to say something. If you want to say anything at the end, yes, closing remarks.
Well, I just wanted to say, well, first of all, thank you again, Dari Dari Dhanyavad. This has just been an honor to be able to have this conversation with you and with the larger audience. And I just wanted to say that I'm always interested in hearing about people's experiences with the Swasthani, and I'm always interested in learning about the kitab and the grant that they have in their families, and if they have different stories or different details. And so I just want to invite anyone who happens to be listening and hears this, or has the opportunity to read and think about any of my work. I would love to hear from you. And so please do feel free to reach out to me, to share with me your own Swasthani experiences, and if there's unique things in your own family tradition. It's something that I'm always be interested in, and hope to continue kind of filling in pieces of the puzzle moving forward, even though I'm also working on other projects now. But in any case, I just wanted to say thank you, and extend that invitation for others to reach out to me if they have reason to.
Thank you, Jessica. So, दर्शकबिन जाँदा जाँदै हैन, I have to thank so many people. So besides that, so eDaboo team that for the technical aspects, Manjit Fresta in North Carolina, Santosh Fresta in California. Similarly, the local, my local colleagues, Vijay Bajracharya, Prajwal Maharjan, Umesh Fresta. Similarly, as there are so many colleagues as well as friends, well-wishers from Old Newar organization, USA chapter. So, and we are really, yes, we would be looking for some other, yes, session with you, Jessica. So whenever we have some of the new things that's coming on, definitely we will approach you. And once again, thank you so much. And saying so we would like to conclude today's session. And Thong Yata Bye, Subhai.